Hello, Alex.
Hi.
We can start, I think.
Okay, whenever you want.
We are ready for you.
Okay. Do you want me to start?
Yes, please.
Very good. Okay.
Almost 30 people here.
Sorry?
We are almost 30 people here. We are watching you live, and there is almost 30 people in the Zoom.
Okay, excellent.
Okay, we can start now.
Okay. So I start, yeah? Sorry, okay. Hello, everyone. I want, first of all, to express my solidarity with the students and staff at Bogazici University, excuse my bad Turkish, in your struggle to retain the autonomy you need as a university. I don't know if it's any comfort, but you should be aware that this is a time when universities are under attack everywhere. And I would say they're under attack in two ways. First of all, you have government authoritarianism. I don't need to tell you in Turkey what that means, but we experience it in Britain. The Conservative government in Britain has just announced that they're going to appoint what they call a free speech czar for universities. It's interesting to use the word czar because the Russian czars weren't famous for being, liberal or democratic or anything like that. And it gives a warning because what they mean by free speech is really suppressing critical voices. You know, if people want to interrogate the bloody history of British imperialism, if they want to have courses changed to take into account the whole experience of imperialism and racism and so on and so forth, then this is a threat to free speech. So this is what we're facing in Britain, not as acute as what you're experiencing as Bogazici, but still a very serious threat. The second threat to universities is more insidious and systemic. It's the process of neoliberal restructuring, the transformation of universities into businesses that compete for students. And this process has gone very far in countries like Britain and is having an enormously damaging effect on the quality of education. We have neoliberal managements who really are not interested in the needs or wishes of either students or staff. And this has been shown in various ways, again in Britain, where they've mishandled the pandemic. So I feel very strong solidarity with you all. It's also a pleasure to speak to people at Bogazici University. My grandfather in the 1890s, so a long time ago, studied there when it was Robert College. So I have a sort of personal identification with it. I think I spoke for the first time at the university about 10 years ago, in person, not virtually like this. So it's a great pleasure for personal reasons to be speaking to you. Now, the title of my talk is The Age of Catastrophe and Revolt. You can say it's not a very cheerful title, but it's important to keep in mind the combination. Don't just focus either on catastrophe or revolt. Focus on the combination, catastrophe and revolt. What do I mean by catastrophe? Humankind, and it really is humankind, the whole population of the planet, are facing multiple crises. The ones I'll focus on are three. economic, biological, and political. First of all, the economic crisis. The pandemic precipitated the biggest global economic slump since the 1930s. The 1930s, so-called Great Depression, were the worst economic crisis in the history of capitalism. This one may be even worse. We still have to see how it unfolds. In Britain, it's actually more severe. Britain is experiencing the worst slump since, I don't know, the beginning of the 18th century, for 300 years, although I don't think statistically that means very, very much. It was, as I said, precipitated by the pandemic, but at least in the so-called advanced capitalist countries, the crisis was waiting to happen before March last year because of the deep weaknesses of capitalism in North America and Europe that became visible with the global financial crisis in 2007-8. But the pandemic has certainly made things worse, and the levels of suffering, of impoverishment, unemployment, and starvation are particularly acute in different parts of the global south. For example, the most precarious workers in the advanced countries, so-called, are migrant workers. Migrant workers are particularly likely to lose their jobs and indeed to suffer from the virus as well because of the kind of conditions they live and work in. That means that they can't send money back to their families back home. So there's been a huge drop in remittances from north to south globally, which is a very important way of mitigating the chronic poverty that exists in the south. That's just one example. Then there are many others. The so-called advanced economies are being held up by huge government subsidies and borrowing. Sooner or later, those will come to an end, and then we'll see big jumps in unemployment. It's a very severe situation economically. Secondly, we have the biological crisis, if you like, the struggle between humankind and the coronavirus, which we know to be an extremely savage violence in what it does to people. They started off saying this was a virus that would only affect old people, people like me, I'm 70, people like me are vulnerable. It's not a problem for young people. Last weekend, a former student of mine called Ed Ruxby, quite an important Marxist scholar in Britain, a man in his 40s, very strong and healthy and so on, before he got COVID-19, died. That's an example of the kind of universal threat the virus faces. And its struggle for fitness, its struggle by natural selection is leading to the development of variants that are harder to deal with because they're more infectious or resistant to the vaccines that scientists have fortunately very quickly been able to develop. But we have to see the pandemic not as just some strange, terrible thing that has happened to us. In the 14th century, the Christian 14th century, in the Middle Ages, a third of the population of Europe died because of the Black Death, the bubonic plague, as the Black Death was the name they gave for that particular pandemic. And I imagine that most of the people who suffered in the Black Death saw it as a kind of visitation from God. God had done, people had been wicked, and so God was punishing them. But, it was an event from outside human experience that hit people. We can't see the pandemic like that. The pandemic is just one example of the way in which, of the kind of turning point we've reached, where capitalism's destruction of nature is becoming toxic, is having increasingly catastrophic effects. This is something that Karl Marx wrote about, most importantly in the third volume of his great book, Capital, where he said that capitalism introduces a rift in the metabolism between labor and nature. What he meant by that is human beings are part of nature. We interact with the rest of nature. We have what Marx calls material interchanges between us and the rest of nature via our labor. So this is what Marx means by the labor, the metabolism between labor and nature. But he says this is breaking down under capitalism, or capitalism is breaking it down. The example he mainly uses is the damaging effect of the chemicals used to increase or maintain output in agriculture. But we know the rift takes many other forms, most pervasively the process of climate change, which I'll come back to. In the case of the pandemic, what we see is the way in which the neoliberal integration of the world economy, sorry about that, the neoliberal integration of the world economy, you're safe from my sneezes because I'm separated from you virtually. The pandemic, neoliberal capitalism and the kind of globalization of capital that has involved the greater and greater human penetration of nature and of the wild parts of the world. And this means that human beings and their domesticated animal populations interact more with wild species that often act as an incubator of viruses like COVID-19. So, and then, you know, once the virus makes the leap from whatever it was, bats to human beings, then the global integration of capitalism means it spreads very quickly from wherever it started to the rest of the world. But there are other catastrophes. Now, I want to use the example of what's happening in Texas, in the United States. Texas famously is one of the biggest American states. It's also one of the richest. Why? Because it's got oil and natural gas. And this has lifted its fortunes in the 20th and early 21st centuries. At the minute, people in Texas are largely without clean water, without heating, without electric power. There are millions of homes that have been deprived of these in the past few days. This is because there's been what we Anglo-Saxons call a cold snap. The weather has been much colder in that part of the United States, and this has led to a breakdown of the power system. But this isn't just an accident. It reflects two things. First of all, climate change, and we have to see climate change as a consequence of what Marx calls the capitalist accumulation process, the development in particular of industrial capitalism reliant on the consumption of fossil fuels, starting with the Industrial Revolution 2 centuries ago, but in the 20th century, in particular because of our reliance on or capitalism's reliance on the internal combustion engine and its relentless appetite for fossil fuels. Now, climate change produces more extreme weather events. Extreme weather events, whether very hot or very cold, become more frequent as a result of climate change. So we've had, in 2019, we had terrible floods in East Africa that destroyed quite a big African city, the port of Beira in Mozambique. Then we have had the wildfires, first in the Amazon And then more recently in Australia, in the Western United States, last September, the great city of San Francisco, it was dark at noon because of the smoke from the wildfire. I contacted at the time the great American eco-Marxist John Bellamy Foster, who lives in the West Coast of the US in Oregon, and he and his family had to take refuge in Portland, the main city, because of the extent of the wildfires that were taking place. So extreme weather events, in this case, the cold snap in the central United States in Texas is one factor behind what's happened. The other is the kind of deregulation of the electricity industry that has taken place in Texas and more broadly in the so-called advanced capitalist countries. In Texas, one of the main architects of this deregulation was a certain governor called George W. Bush, who went on, of course, to destroy Iraq, but he did a pretty bad job in Texas as well, because it led to a power industry dominated by firms that seek to cut costs as possible and reduce energy prices and then therefore get customers. But what that meant was they cut back investment. So there's no investment to, or not nowhere like enough investment to protect against winter cold when it happens, and also no spare capacity in the system. None of what management experts these days call resilience, the extra capacity to allow you to get you through a crisis. Now, when I talk about that second aspect and the lack of resilience, this is a common feature of neoliberal capitalism. One of the things we've been struggling with in the pandemic is that public health services have been cut back so much that the extra capacity, meaning everything from oxygen machines to doctors and nurses, haven't been there to help to nurse people when they fall ill from COVID-19. So the stripping down of the power industry in Texas is an illustration of a much more common phenomenon in contemporary capitalism. Okay, so that's the biological crisis, more broadly, the crisis in humankind's relationship to nature. Thirdly, we have a political crisis. Now, I don't want to spend much time on this, but just to say, globally, we see the rise of the far right. Neoliberal capitalism is decaying. It's because of the kind of problems I'm describing, it's lost political credibility. The kind of mainstream parties of the center, whether center right or center left, have lost support, and this has created openings by parties that at least present themselves as anti-systemic, as outsiders. Unfortunately, on the whole, it hasn't been parties of the left that have made breakthroughs through this. It's been parties of the far right. The most important example of this is, of course, Trump's election in the US 4 years ago, and the seizure of the Capitol by far-right supporters of Trump on the 6th of January, something that is extraordinary. You know, this is the strongest imperialist country in the world. You know, it's had peaceful transitions of power ever since it was set up in the 1780s, and suddenly you have this mass of nasty, armed, right-wing people who are able to seize control of the building where its parliament, the Congress meets. This is a warning of the advance of the far right and of how the fact that Trump lost the election in November doesn't mean that the threat of the far right in the United States or indeed anywhere else has gone away. So we have a profound political crisis as well. Now, what I want to emphasize that this is a qualitative shift. So for decades, scientists, ecological activists, Marxist political economists, various critics have been saying, look, if we allow, for example, the process of climate change to continue, this will lead to catastrophe. But those were forward projections. Catastrophe will happen in the future. Now, the catastrophes are here. They're happening all around us and affecting our lives in all sorts of ways, very obviously, with the pandemic and the social distancing, the isolation, the lockdowns, the fear, the suffering, the bereavement. But simultaneously, with the catastrophe, we have revolt. So I said an age of catastrophe, but also an age of revolt. And we've seen this very clearly in the last couple of years with the kind of movements of protest that have seized a number of societies. Very interestingly, in the Middle East, Lebanon and Iraq, both societies that have suffered terribly at the hands of the imperialist and also the regional powers in their struggles for dominance of the region. We've seen it in Chile, which has suffered itself very badly, first from the military coup in 1973, and then from the neoliberalism that the generals brought with them, or the generals' advisors did. We've seen, for example, the risings in Algeria and Sudan, so showing that the coup by Field Marshal Sisi in 2013, or the destruction of Syria and the civil war, didn't end the Arab revolutions. The Arab revolutions continue. We've seen other movements starting a bit earlier than 2019, the Gilets Jaunes protest movement in France. We see a diversity of different protest movements. And what's interesting is the revolts have continued into the pandemic. One very good example, I think on the whole the most important example, is the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States. A black man is murdered by the police in Minneapolis in last summer, and this leads to an explosion that's not just about the racist brutality of the police, but more generally the systemic racism that is deeply embedded in American society and the American political order, that sweeps not just through the US, but that wins solidarity in other parts of the world. For example, in Britain, there was a very extensive solidarity movement last summer, which led to these great moments when the statues of, for example, a famous slave-owning merchant called Colston in the city of Bristol, which was one of the main beneficiaries of the slave trade in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. Colston statue is torn down. And this is just an example. There are lots and lots of others. So the pandemic didn't still the voice of protest. We see this again in France with the continuance of the Gilets Jaunes movement and big movements of social protest, movements of opposition to the Macron government's increasingly repressive policies. I mean, the Macron government now takes seriously the idea of what they call Islamo-leftism. You know, that there's a conspiracy by Islamist radicals and Marxists, which, you know, you have to be just completely intellectually and politically illiterate to believe such nonsense, but they're acting on it and there's resistance to it. In Greece, you have the jailing of the leaders of the Golden Dawn fascist party, in which the very lively and powerful anti-fascist and anti-racist movement in Greece made a very powerful role. So you have revolt intertwined with catastrophe. That's the way I define the present situation. Now, the revolts in turn feeded into the crisis. So you know, the far right in the US reacted ferociously to Black Lives Matter because at the core, of course, the far right are deeply racist, not just against Black people, anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, and so on. So their worst nightmare is when Black people and not just Black people, Latinx people, white people and so on come together to oppose racism. So they mounted counter demonstrations, armed attacks and so on. And if you look at the films of the storming of the Capitol on the 6th of January, you see Confederate flags all over the place. In other words, the flags of the slave states that tried to secede from the United States in 1861, after Abraham Lincoln was elected, and who were defeated in the following civil war. This is a symbol almost as bad, maybe as bad in its way as the Nazi swastika, of the most profound kind of racism. So there's an interaction between the revolts and the far right. There is a struggle going on. There's a really powerful and dangerous battle going on. So I would say we're caught between horror and hope. The horror is all around us and nearby now. It's not just something distant for anyone. But the hope is there in the kind of movements from below that we've seen, in the resistance that is taking place. But for the hope to be real, for the hope to be fulfilled, the kind of movements I'm talking about can't just be movements of protest or even movements of resistance, important that is. They have to represent, they have to become a fight for a different kind of world. Because this world, the world of capitalism, is coming to an end. So the question is, what comes next? What comes after capitalism? That's the issue that we confront today. Now, if we're talking about getting rid of capitalism, we need politics and we need organization. We need politics, and I don't just mean politics in the sense of making speeches like I am or engaging in maneuvers and that kind of thing, which is what professional politicians mainly do. I mean a kind of politics, a different kind of politics that is rooted in an understanding of what is wrong with the world, and in particular rooted in an understanding that the problem is capitalism. Capitalism is a system that Marx showed is founded upon the exploitation of wage labor, the exploitation of workers, and a worker is anyone who, because of their economic conditions, their lack of security, what sometimes these days is called precarity, but it's a precarity that everyone in the working class shares in a fundamental way, because of their economic insecurity, is forced to sell their labor power in order to live, and therefore ends up being exploited by the capitalists who have the money to put people to work by getting them to produce things or perform services or all the other things that workers do in capitalism. And we've seen in the crisis caused by the pandemic how important are the apparently modest and unskilled manual workers who pick the food, drive the trucks, carrying the food to the supermarkets, who stack the shelves of the supermarkets, who drive the buses, who clean up after us, because cleanliness is so important in dealing with a pandemic, that the world continues to rest. The world of capitalism continues to rest on the shoulders of poorly paid manual workers who, because of the conditions in which they live and work, are often particularly vulnerable to the pandemic. So capitalism is a system of the exploitation of wage labor. It's also a system of accumulation, competitive accumulation. This is another thing that Marx emphasized. The capitalist class isn't a unified group. It's what Marx called a band of hostile brothers. They compete with each other. Each capitalist, each group of capitalists, each so-called nation and its state trying to grab as big a share of the profits that are extracted from workers for itself. And this is, as much as the exploitation, the accumulation is the problem, because accumulation is because it's driven by competition, is a blind process. Capitalists are constantly looking to their rivals to see if they're more efficient than them, if they've come up with a better technique or a better product than them. They're continually comparing themselves with their rivals. No one, it's inherent in capitalism as a system that there's no point of collectively looking towards the future of society as a whole. So capitalism is a system that is pushed ahead blindly by this process of competition. And this process of competition is driving us off a cliff. Now I'm mixing the metaphors, that producing catastrophes that are both economic but also biological, as I've tried to show. But again, to go back to Marx, because so much of what he says is more relevant now than when he wrote it back in the 19th century. People who say that Marx is an outdated 19th century thinker haven't read Marx or looked at the world in which we live in today. Marx says that capitalism, it's one of his most famous sayings, also produces its own grave diggers. In other words, that when we talk about the exploitation of capital, the exploitation of wage labor by capital, it's easy to see the workers just as victims. Here they are, being paid badly, lousy working conditions, unsafe working conditions, all sorts of bad things, bad housing, and it's important, as Marx did for his time, to document all those bad working and living conditions and so on. But the other side to exploitation is that the workers, through this exploitation, are providing capitalists with the profits on which they depend. In other words, the relationship of capital and wage labor is a relationship of interdependence. The workers need the capitalists, they need the employment, the wages they get from the capitalists, but the capitalists need the workers. Without the workers' labor, the capitalists can't get their profits. This gives workers power. If they become organized and self-conscious, they have the power to change the world. And it's the workers who represent the hope of the world. They represent the real future. So that Marx's vision of socialism is a transformation that comes from below. Workers emancipating themselves. No one doing it for them freeing themselves through a fundamentally democratic process. Now, because of all sorts of defeats that we experienced in the 20th century, the working class movement isn't as strong as it really needs to be. But that lack of strength isn't fundamental. Workers have enormous power. It's simply a question, as I said before, of becoming organized and self-conscious. And organized socialists have a role to play in this. That's why I talked about organization. It's necessary for socialists to organize, to contribute to the process through which workers become self-conscious and come to see that they have the ability to change the world and to save us from a future that will be otherwise simply catastrophe after catastrophe. So what individuals do, if they come to band together in an organization that works systematically to win workers to socialism is very, very important. And that's why I'm very happy to speak in association with my friends and comrades in DİSİP, in the Revolutionary Socialist Workers' Party in Turkey, because I think what they're doing is very important. And if you find what I've been saying at all persuasive, then I hope you will join us in helping to save us all from a future of catastrophe. Okay, I'll stop there. So I'm very happy to answer questions, whatever kind of discussion you want to have. Thanks a lot.
All right, thank you, Alex. Now we are going into question answer part. You can raise hand to Zoom, or for my friends here watching with me, you can just also raise hand so I can convey your question. Any questions? Right, then maybe I can ask you one. Apart from the last thing you have said, what do you see, what shall we do? I mean, what shall we do in the face of this emerging crises and the situation with capitalism in a global sense? Or, I mean, do you consider these protests to express these problems locally, or do you see this solidarity to, to rise globally? What do you think? How do you project it?
Do you want me to come back straight away while people are thinking, or what? Or do you want to collect some questions?
As far as I can see, at the moment there are no questions to be asked. There are no raised hands, so maybe we can.
I'll give people time to think of the many things that are wrong with what I said. Well, I think in a general sense, there's an old green slogan which is helpful, which says, think globally, act locally. In other words, you have to start where you are and to confront the particular form that this general crisis takes in your own situation, and organize to respond to that. I don't know enough about what's happening at your university to comment in detail about that, but for example, in British universities, there's been an enormous pressure from university managements to make students and staff go into the universities for teaching to take place, which is very dangerous for all concerned, not just because it's very hard to organize social distancing inside classrooms, but also because I'm retired now, but I taught at a university in London. If you traveling on a bus or a metropolitan train, very crowded, that's dangerous too. So, and this is true of many, many other groups of workers in different sectors and so on, there's a very important effort to resist those kinds of pressures. In the case of universities, to insist on teaching online. In Britain, School Teachers Union was able to impose the closure of schools when the infections were rising very sharply after Christmas. Act locally, that's to say, in response to the concrete circumstances you find yourself in, but think globally. In other words, think about how your struggle is related to the struggle of people in other parts of the the world. So, for example, university teachers in Britain should be thinking, among other things, about supporting their colleagues, their counterparts in Bogazici University, so that they can, so that both groups can help to win their struggles. So that's a very quick and superficial response. But I see now there's some questions. Maybe shall I look at those questions?
I can read them if you want.
Okay, there's a question about the relevance of socialism. There's a question about the rise of the far right. And then there's a question about concrete solidarity. Okay, shall I deal with those questions? I can read them out as I respond to them. Is that all right?
Yeah, I can read one by one, and you
okay.
can answer.
Yeah, okay, fine.
I am starting now. How do you see the contrast between the uprisings all over the world and the weakness of socialist movements? How can socialists take an important role in this catastrophic era?
Well, the contrast is right, and it reflects the decline of the organized left, not just in Turkey or in Britain, but internationally, I would say, since a high point that was reached in the 1970s. There are two reasons for the decline of the organized left. One is reflects the fact that the high point was at a time when workers' struggles were very militant and often successful in different parts of the world. But then we have the neoliberal counteroffensive. David Harvey has argued that we have to see neoliberalism as a counter-revolution that is aimed to shift the balance of class forces back in favor of capital, which I think is broadly right. Now, unfortunately, that offensive, that counter-revolution was successful, and workers' struggles suffered bad defeats. And I think that's in really our most serious problem, because if workers' struggles aren't demonstrating practical success, it's harder to imagine a different kind of world. The second reason is that the politics of the organized left was very dependent on two traditions. One is social democracy. In other words, we can use parliament to transform society radically. The other tradition was Stalinism in all sorts of different forms, but essentially taking the so-called socialist countries, the USSR or China or wherever, as a model of socialism. And unfortunately, both these versions of socialism led in the wrong direction. Reformism fails. There's a question in the chat about people like Corbyn and so on. Jeremy Corbyn, the former leader of the Labour Party, recently has been driven from the leadership after an electoral defeat. In a way, what happened to him is a summary of how the forces of the status quo are able to either break or corrupt reformist leaderships. They couldn't corrupt Corbyn, so they broke him. And that's happened in more extreme forms, for example, the murder of Allende in Chile. In the case of Stalinism, unfortunately, the Stalinist countries were not socialist. They were state capitalist societies where workers were exploited. Both these are traditions of what has been called socialism from above, where change is imposed on workers. And because that's how change is sought, no real change is possible. So, but those traditions, the traditions of reformism and Stalinism, are still very influential. So it's a question of, so what it means to revive socialism is really a combination of two things. First of all, being involved in whatever struggles are happening, not sitting in your study, just reading and commenting, you know, these days, tweeting or blogging or whatever it is, but being involved in the practical struggles of the day in whatever form that those struggles take. Secondly, it means trying to show that there's a different conception of socialism, the conception of socialism from below that comes from Marx, and that involves a radically democratic way of changing society. Now, the problem is that people with these sorts of ideas have been on the margins of the left for a long time, since the time of the Russian Revolution and its aftermath 100 years ago. But we have to still struggle to widen the influence of these ideas. Maybe I'll come back to this, but I think that's enough on that question. So can we move on to the next one? Rumasa,
Okay.
can we move on to the next question?
Yes, of course. I will read one of the YouTube commenters' questions, and we are looking to the time to order the questions.
Right. Okay.
Okay. How do you comment on the tie between catastrophe and scientific development? Do you think these types of crises might lead growing interest in science?
Sorry, could you repeat that? I didn't really understand it.
Of course. How do you comment on the tie between a catastrophe and scientific development? Do you think these type of crises might lead growing interest in science?
Growing interest in science?
Yes.
Science, okay. Well, I mean, what Marx said that under capitalism, science becomes a force of production. In other words, to achieve the increases in productivity and profits that are really what capitalism is about, scientific inquiry into the structure of nature has to be systematically utilized by capitalism. And of course, we see this in the 20th and 21st centuries, not simply in the form of more and more intensive scientific research going into the development of civilian products, but also the use of science to develop means of production, means of destruction of arms and so on and so forth. This brings out the ambivalence of science under capitalism, that it can be something that liberates us through increasing our knowledge, you know, solving diseases and so, all that kind of thing. But it can also, the increase in knowledge can also be used for destructive purposes, whether it's the destruction of nature through promoting climate change, or whether it's more directly destructive means. So science is ambivalent. Now, the pandemic shows how useful science can be, because first of all, you have the very rapid identification of the virus, and then you have these extraordinarily rapid development of different kinds of vaccines. The problem is that these scientific, you know, this in a way incredible tribute to the capacities of contemporary scientific research when they're mobilized in a desirable goal, also show how everything is shaped and distorted by capitalism. So the vaccines have largely been developed in alliance with big pharma, with the big pharmaceutical companies, and big pharmaceutical companies do nothing for free. I mean, the one exception might have been the Oxford University vaccine, but they wanted just to, you know, develop the vaccine and offer it freely to whoever wanted to use it. But they were persuaded by that great philanthropist, Bill Gates, and his foundation to link up with a big pharma company, AstraZeneca. And so the vaccines are very much in the control of a big pharma. But secondly, as I'm sure we all know, the rich countries, Britain, Europe, the United States, have bought up huge quantities of vaccine doses, far more than they need for their peoples, whereas governments in the global south, because they're much poorer, haven't been able to get access to anything like the vaccines that the number of vaccines that we need. So this symbolizes the gap, the ambivalence of science in the contemporary world. Science is an enormously valuable resource. I mean, I should say simply because of the deeper understanding of the world that it can offer, but also in very practical terms like the vaccines. But the development of the sciences is distorted by the framework in which we operate, the capitalist framework. So in a way, one of the things that achieving a communist society, a class society would be about is not just liberating human beings and in a certain way liberating nature, but also liberating science. I think that's all I have to say on that topic.
I will read Hilmi Uyar's question now.
Okay.
You mentioned the rise of far right, but it doesn't seem like a total rise, which is based on the defeat of the international working class. So the current phenomenon differs from the rise of classical fascist powers like Salazar, Franco, Mussolini, or Hitler. It seems like this relative rise is based on the defeat of the reformist policies, which are represented by Syriza in Greece, by Podemos in Spain, by Mélenchon in France, by Corbyn in England, by Sanders in USA, by Workers' Party in Brazil, etc. To sum up, is it possible to say that this relative rise of the far right is actually a punishment of the masses to the reformist parties? And if it's the case, what is the political balance sheet of the respect experience of England, according to you? Because if I remember it correctly, if I remember it right, you promoted the respect experience as a new strategy of building of revolutionary alternatives.
Okay, I think it's absolutely true that we haven't faced the direct defeats that we did in the interwar years. Say the defeat of the German Revolution between 1918 and 23, the defeat of the factory occupations in Italy in September 1920, or the kind of defeat, physical military defeat, that the left in Spain suffered during the Civil War in the second half of the 1930s. So the scales of direct defeat have been less acute. I think that though we can say that over the last generation, there's been a process of attrition, defeats of particular groups of workers, but also restructuring of working conditions, erosion of trade union organization, which have certainly contributed to a shift of the balance of class forces in favor of the bosses. I would say, how much can you hold left reformist parties? Incidentally, I don't think the Workers' Party is a left reformist party. It's much more like New Labour under Tony Blair, or the SPD in Germany, but that's a fairly minor thing. I would say, as I said before, we see the progressive breakdown of the neoliberal centre, whether centre-right or centre-left, really since the global financial crisis. That created an opportunity for left-wing alternatives to grow and to develop, but to the extent that they did, that they failed. the most important example of the failure is Syriza in Greece, the coalition of the radical left, which, as the name suggests, had very much a militant background in its formation and history, but which, when it finally got office in January 2015, behaved like a conventional social democratic government and capitulated to the European Union in implementing austerity and so on. So we, and this is partly what I meant by saying that the traditions in different ways of reformism and Stalinism continue to hold back the working class movement today. If we're talking about and that then made it easier for the far right to make the kind of advances that they did. But yeah, we're not in January 1933, when Hitler came to power. The far right are, still relatively weak forces. That's not a reason for being relaxed about their advance. It's a reason to stop them now, to break them now, while they're still comparatively weak, to mobilize against them now. In Britain, we've been relatively successful at holding back the organized fascist organizations that have risen successively at different points since the 1970s, because we mounted mass mobilizations, for example, with the Anti-Nazi League in the 1970s, to stop them at their embryonic stage. The problem is that capitalism constantly creates conditions for new fascist movements. So if we really want to end fascism, we have to get rid of capitalism. Now, just on the question of respect, which is now a slightly antiquated question, if we want the revolutionary left to become more influential, that means that we must look for openings that can involve the collaboration between revolutionaries and reformists. That's really what we tried to do with Respect, the Socialist Workers' Party of Britain tried to do. Respect came out of the anti-war movements, different people on the left who'd worked together in the Stop the War coalition in Britain, who decided to try and build an alternative to Labour. Now, because there are other questions and so on, I don't want to go into it in too much detail. Funnily enough, the reason why Respect failed was the reformist wing was too weak. The Socialist Workers' Party was too strong in Respect compared to the reformist forces. That's because only one prominent figure from the Labour Party, George Galloway, broke from Labour at that point. And so the reformist wing of Respect was too weak and too dependent on, let me be polite and say, the idiosyncrasies of Galloway. We tried to get more mainstream figures on the left of the Labour Party, like Tony Benn and Jeremy Corbyn, to join us, but unfortunately they didn't. If we'd been able to create a broader party to the left of Labour, that would have created all sorts of tensions and struggles, because, as I've just indicated, there are problems with reformist politics. Corbyn himself failed when he became leader of the Labour Party, but it would have created a more dynamic pole of attraction on the left of British politics that could have had long-term effects in laying the basis of a real revolutionary party. But it didn't work out like that. But I don't regret trying it at all. Okay, I'll leave that answer there. So next question.
Okay. This is Yıldız Silier's question. Can you give us some concrete suggestions about how to develop international solidarity, especially with regards to saving universities from authoritarian pressures and neoliberalism? Can there be sanctions against oppressive governments?
Just on the question of sanctions, who's going to mount the sanctions? Where are they going to come from? Who's going to organize the sanctions? I mean, I think that that's a critical question. Again and again, it's a question of agency. This is particularly important when it comes to sanctions, because it's now sanctions are now a powerful tool in the diplomacy kit of the United States. And they use it against governments which they say are illiberal and so on and so forth. But it's quite, if we look at who they actually target, it's people who are states that are outside the US sphere of influence. So they target Russia, for example. There are lots of bad things the Russian government does, but I don't need to tell people in Turkey that the Saudi Arabian regime does lots of bad things. It doesn't get targeted for sanctions, despite those bad things, because it's part of the American nexus of alliances. And what happens is the US uses its dominance of the financial system to shut countries out in the way in which it's done to Iran quite recently. That kind of sanctions, or campaigning for that kind of sanctions, we should have nothing to do with. Campaigns of boycotts that are organized by workers are a different thing. And there's a good tradition, for example, among dock laborers, which are traditionally a very militant group of workers, of refusing to handle arms, for example, arms for the fascists during the Spanish Civil War, in boycotting apartheid South Africa, and so on and so forth. So if you like, sanctions from below, if they can be organized, are much more effective. Short of that, solidarity among different groups of workers in different countries, or indeed among students, is something that I think is important and that can be achieved. I mean, I've been part of efforts to provide solidarity for academics in Turkey, for example, who are subject to enormous pressures by the present government. But it's important. So I'm not saying it's easy to organize international solidarity, but it's possible. And it shouldn't be confused with sanctions, which bring in capitalist interests, which all are invariably against the interests of the people that you're trying to help. I think that's all I would say about that.
I will read another one from YouTube. It is Ayşe Yılmaz's question. And I think she means that your speech, not the answers, by saying circumstances. I am reading it now. Do you think establishing a communal democratic nature-based system is possible under these circumstances?
Sorry, you're going to have to read the question again. Okay. I'm really sorry.
Do you think establishing a communal democratic nature-based system is possible under these circumstances?
A communal democratic-based system? Is that a communal democratic-based system? Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, fine. I think it's possible to create elements of democratic organization from below. That's true, for example, through at least sometimes student unions. It's through the trade union movement, other forms of communal organization that sometimes involve alternative forms of production, like the cooperative movement. I mean, the cooperative movement, for example, started in the 19th century. Marx was aware of it and was sympathetic to it, in particular to its goals. So yeah, we can create democratic spaces within capitalism. The problem is that they're not permanent, and they're therefore fragile and vulnerable, because capitalism is fundamentally an undemocratic system, which can be forced to tolerate democratic spaces and may sometimes find it in its interest to tolerate those spaces. When its interest changes, when the balance of forces changes, then it can move against those spaces and seek to crush them. That's why you know, one way of describing socialism is it's a struggle to not simply defend existing democratic spaces, but to widen them as far as possible. But ultimately, that means overthrowing the existing system, breaking the power of the capitalist state. As long as we don't do that, then those democratic spaces will be vulnerable. But sure, it's a great thing to build those spaces, you know, as circumstances give you an opportunity to do that and to strengthen the existing spaces.
Okay, this is the last question.
Okay.
This question coming from Tinkerbell from YouTube, and now I am reading it. How can a socialist society escape totalitarianism?
Oh, well, that's a classic question. How can a socialist society escape totalitarianism? I prefer to put it more simplistically, because I think the concept of totalitarianism is problematic in ways that it's not relevant to discuss here. To say, how can a socialist society avoid becoming a dictatorship? And this is, of course, a relevant question, very relevant question, because of the experience of Stalinism, and how a very democratic revolution, October 1917 in Russia, turned into this awful tyranny that killed millions of people, directly or indirectly. Marx said, human beings make history, but not in circumstances of their own choosing. So in Russia in 1917, you had this great democratic breakthrough, but in a way it relates to the last question as well, because it created an enormous crack in the existing system. You had these workers and soldiers and peasants' councils ruling this huge country, Russia, but the rest of the world was much bigger, and Russia was much less economically developed than, say, Western Europe or the United States. And the leaders of the Russian Revolution, like Lenin and Trotsky, were very much aware of this weakness, and therefore they pressed to spread the revolution internationally, so that the crack in the system got wider and wider until the system broke apart completely. Unfortunately, that was unsuccessful. I've referred to, for example, the defeat of the German Revolution in the early 1920s, but also, very important, the defeat of the Chinese Revolution in the mid-1920s. And that meant that the pressure of global capitalism was closing the gap. The form, and the gap closed. The crack was covered over. The thing that puzzled people was it didn't take the form of open counter-revolution. It wasn't like General Franco and his fascist-supported army destroying the Spanish Republic by marching into Madrid and Barcelona and so on. It was more that the regime, what had come out of a workers' revolution in the Soviet Union, changed internally. The democracy fell away, and you had a more and more bureaucratic and terroristic regime taking over. Now, but still using a socialist language, which is still a source of confusion for many people on the left. Now, so there, human beings made history, but in circumstances that eventually overwhelmed them. And it's the circumstances, it's the objective pressures from the capitalist system that are the real force behind the different forms of authoritarianism and dictatorship that we face. So that means that when we make a breakthrough somewhere, we have to learn the lessons of the Russian Revolution and make sure that this time the breakthrough spreads, the crack widens until the existing system disappears. Now, it's easy to say that, you know, people like Lenin and Trotsky and Rosa Luxemburg and so on were far greater people than me, and they didn't succeed. So it's really difficult to do this, to achieve global socialist revolution, which is really what we're talking about. But that's what we need. That's what will ensure that the revolution remains democratic and self-governing. And it's very important to be clear about what we need, because the threats to us, the swelling catastrophes, are very real indeed. I'll leave it there.
There is another question from Zoom. I am reading now Banu Jan's question. How powerful are university workers' unions in the UK in the face of neoliberal and authoritarian pressures?
Well, one of the good things about the neoliberal period in universities in Britain is that it's led to a growth of serious trade unionism, because traditionally academics didn't regard themselves as ordinary workers. We were professionals, you know. When I first became an academic, we didn't have a union in my sector. We had a professional association. Because it was too low grade to have a trade union. But the neoliberal restructuring of universities has broken down those sorts of barriers. So we have a union that is large and it's been growing, the University and College Union. And it's mounted two national strikes, one in 2019 and a second in 2020. Both strikes involved a lot of militancy and very good active pickets and solidarity between teachers and students and so on and so forth. So they were very positive in lots of ways. The first strike in 2018, I think, was much the more successful, partly because it's achieved some, not enough, but some concessions from the employers. But also because it drew much larger numbers of people into union activism. That led to a change in the union leadership, involving in particular the election of a general secretary who'd been active in the strike and so on and so forth. But unfortunately, the leadership of the union, if anything, became weaker for reasons I don't fully understand, but it became politically weaker. And the leadership was much less enthusiastic about the second strike and allowed it to end in confusion as the pandemic developed, but also failed to take a good lead in protecting university workers against what the university managements were trying to do, which, as I said before, involved trying to force university workers and students back physically into university in very dangerous conditions. This contrasts unfavorably with the school teachers union, which took a very firm stance at the beginning of this year when the government had forced the reopening of schools. This had led to a rapid rise in infections and increasingly dangerous situation, and the University Workers Union insisted that on safety grounds that the schools were closed, and the government gave way, and it forced the government to introduce a much more extensive lockdown, which has at least temporarily improved the situation. So there's a mixed record in the case of the University and College Union, but I hope, I'm retired now, so I'm not directly involved in the struggle anymore. But I very much hope that my comrades and colleagues who are working in universities will learn from the example of the School Teachers Union, because that's the way to go in the face of the pandemic.
There is another question. Do you have time for another question?
Yeah, sure. I think it'd be good to finish soon, but yeah, no, I'm happy to answer another question.
Okay, I am reading then. Eda Deniz question. We all know how important universities are for a country, and there is one-man management in our country. In these conditions, there is no scientific study or freedom of opinion, etc. How long will this continue? This way, they are taking our country. Sorry. They are taking our country into darkness, and your name is defined as a crime that people struggle to keep modern life alive. And everything in the country is one, it's managed by the man, but never takes responsibility for the results. If universities lose by independence, it will be hard not to lose our hopes. What do you think?
Okay. I don't understand all the question, like my name becoming a crime.
I did that too.
But it doesn't matter. I get the essence of the question. Let me just say, don't think that one-man management is just a Turkish phenomenon. One man or one woman management is very much the neoliberal style. And it's something that we've seen in universities in Britain is an erosion of the quite limited collective and democratic forms of decision-making and its replacement by a hierarchy, which is at least legitimated by one powerful, it's not always a guy these days, man or woman at the top, the chief executive, the vice chancellor or principal or whatever they call themselves. So this isn't just a unique Turkish phenomenon, although I know you have a very imperial head of state. But I think this is a general trend. I'm optimistic. I think this trend can be turned back. It can be defeated. These powerful figures can be forced to retreat, and they can ultimately be held to account. It depends on how effectively we organize. And that isn't a technical thing, but it's about involving as many people as possible, growing numbers of people, as far as possible, self-organized, can develop the power to defeat these kinds of moves. I'm not saying it's easy, and sometimes it can involve confronting quite frightening repression, but these people can be defeated. One advantage is there aren't that many advantages of being old, but one thing it means for me is I can remember when there was apartheid in South Africa, there were dictatorships throughout Southern Europe, all sorts of oppressive forms of rule. US imperialism was burning Vietnam to the ground, bombing it as they said they would into the Stone Age. All of that was defeated. The apartheid regimes in Southern Africa were swept away. Portuguese colonialism was swept away. The dictatorships in Greece, in Spain, and in Portugal were swept away. We've seen things that at the time, the people of Vietnam won their war for national independence. Things that seemed imaginable happened, and they will happen. Unimaginable things that seemed unimaginable happened, and they will happen again. I assure you that. So, shall I finish on that optimistic note?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for the lecture, and I will ask the saloon for if they have any questions now. Then we can finish. I think there is no question. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Evet.
Good luck to all of you. Good luck to your struggle.
You too.
Thanks.
Have
Okay.
a nice day.
Okay. Bye then. Bye. Thanks. Bye.